talk is the talk will last about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. The first half hour I'll talk about what is an old book, first edition, signed books. I'll show off a few of the things that I brought, give a little bit of my background and history, and tell some stories, anecdotes of people, places, books that I've seen. And then what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes is question and answer. Because I can go on and on and on and on about old books. And at least with question and answer, I can go on about what you want to listen to. The last minute or two of the talk, I will appraise one or two books from the audience to the whole audience in detail. After that, I'll end the formal part of the talk, so anyone who wants to go can go. But I'll stay, I'll answer any and all questions, I'll do any and all appraisals. I'll just do it a lot more quickly so we can get out of here tonight. I guess the first thing that comes up when you talk about old books is what is an old book? And usually people mean by that, what's a valuable old book? Well, the first printed book was in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. If any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you that it's valuable. Matter of fact, the last time one sold, half of it sold for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000 on average, and some even more. So any book, though, printed in the 1400s has value. Some more than others, but anything in the 1400s. After that, it depends on what the book is. You can have a book printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and uninteresting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and uninteresting book now, and nobody cares or will pay very much for it. On the other hand, you can have relatively new books. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book in London, which is only about 20 years old, has sold for up to $80,000. So it's all what people are looking for, what they want. And I get calls at the store and people say, I have an old book and I know it's an old book. And the way I know it's old is the pages are brown and crumbling. Well, I point out that's more lousy paper than it is how old the book is. Now, this is a page from a book that I'll pass around. You'll see that it's not terribly fragile. The paper's white, the ink's black. And this was printed in the 1490s. So this page is a little over 500 years old. And people say sometimes, gee, if they could make books like that then, why don't they do it now? Well, there was a big disadvantage to a book like that. First of all, in the 1490s, you had to be quite wealthy to get an education, to learn how to read. You had to be almost nobility to be able to afford to buy a book like that. Nowadays, maybe the books aren't quite as well made, but they're at a price that can be distributed in the millions. And the real value of books is the knowledge in the books and the dissemination of that knowledge, and I think it's a very good trade-off. Whenever you talk about book collecting, somebody will say to me, I have a first edition. How much is it worth? And I point out that most first editions never came out in a second edition, probably never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody cares about them, wants them, or would pay anything whatsoever. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there are a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature, Dickens, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway. And even within that, there are a lot of things that can make a big difference in the price. The condition being one of the most important. The paper dust jacket on a 20th century book can make all the difference in the world. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes. Absolutely pristine, as if someone took it from the publisher, sealed it away. At the time he got it, he sold it within a week for $750. Wow. At the exact same time, another book deal had the same book, Mosquitoes, Faulkner, first edition, but it didn't have the paper jacket. It had a few tiny little bumps and nicks, nothing terrible. It took them a year to sell it at $40. Because a lot of collecting is prestige. It's being able to say, look what I have. I have the best. I have the most wonderful. Essentially, I have what you don't have, and people who can afford it will pay absolute top price for the very, very best, but might not consider spending anything at all for something even slightly less. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, once again, if the author's unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed doesn't mean that much. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. It might mean an awful lot to your family, but not necessarily adding much to the price. On the other hand, if it's signed by someone famous, maybe Ernest Hemingway, that could add hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to the value. In almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances that add or subtract to the value, and I use signed books to show that off somewhat. There are some authors that are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, for instance, who wrote The Catcher in the Rye. He was reclusive, he lived up in New Hampshire, he didn't appear in public, essentially didn't publish anymore, and other than to a very close personal friend, absolutely would not sign a book. His signature on a book adds thousands of dollars to the value because you just can't get them. And matter of fact, this is a little aside, sometimes people ask me, are there some things that have come by over the years that you sort of wish you could have gotten, but for one reason or another you didn't? And it's sort of like the fish that got away. In any case, one time there was a man who came in, and he was a friend of J.D. Salinger's, and he had a group of letters that Salinger had written him. And they were all very good and valuable, but there was one letter in particular that I still hope maybe someday, but Salinger was looking back on when he first built his house in New Hampshire. And he was telling him about, at the time, when they were laying the foundation, there were a bunch of high school kids who helped lay the foundation. And he sort of said, and one of those kids, he was a pretty good athlete, that kid Carlton Fisk. So Carlton Fisk helped build J.D. Salinger's house. And that letter, actually I think, should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame just because of the connection. In any case, I left a note with the man, maybe, who knows. There are some authors that sign a fair amount of the books. There was a local author, maybe some of you knew him, he lived around here. He wrote wonderful ghost, sea, buried treasure, pirate stories of the New England coast. His name was Edward Rose Snow. Now, Snow used to sign a lot of his books. He was a friend of my father's, and I knew him too. And I remember one day he came into the shop, and he told us he had just been on Cape Cod. He had gone into a bookstore that he had never been in before. Snow went right up to the section where his books were, pulled one off the shelf, opened it up, and exclaimed, "My, a rare, unsigned copy." Then he took out a pen and signed it, and then he introduced himself to the owner of the store. So books signed by Edward Rose Snow don't add as much to the value. When my father had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. Now, just opposite what I was saying before, it was a first edition, but it didn't have the paper jacket. It was well worn and read, but when you opened it up, it was inscribed to the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, in addition to that inscription, when T.S. Eliot read the book, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, crossed things out, added things into just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $200,000, $300,000, maybe even $400,000 because of the association. One last story about signed books. There was an autograph and manuscript dealer in Massachusetts. He was one of the more prominent in the country. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Robert Frost. And he knew Robert Frost. And when he was 13 years old, he went to London and he bought a copy of Frost's first book called A Boy's Will. It's very complicated, what really is the first edition. He paid a lot of money for it, came back to New England. A few weeks later, he met with Frost. He was very proud of himself. He said, "Look what I've got." And Frost looked at it and said, "What did you pay for it?" And he told him, and Frost said, "Give me the book." And Frost took the book, and in the front two end papers wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second, from the third, from the fourth, how they changed bindings, why they changed bindings, the different colors of the bindings, on and on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy and said, "Now it's worth what you paid for it." In any case, let me digress a little, give you a little bit of my history in the history of the store. The history of the Brattle Bookshop goes back to the 1820s. But for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married. My mother had $500. With that, they bought half interest in the store. And my father built the store in his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge, and he was a bit of a character and a showman. We've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly because of urban renewal. And every time my father would move the store, and we've always been in Boston. People call us, they're in Harvard Square on Brattle Street, "Where are you?" We tell them we're in downtown. When my parents first bought the store, there was a little side street in what was Scully Square called Brattle Street. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't even exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. Now, like I say, we have had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. And when my father would move the store, when it was a planned move, he would move the best books to the new location, then he'd run sales. Half-price dollar, 50-cent, quarter, dime. Last day of the sale, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever, ring a big bell, they'd go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, he'd ring the bell again, that group would leave, the next group would come in, and he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969, and we were moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street, where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. And like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman, and if you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team, and on the cover of the covered wagon it said, "Go West, book lovers, go 5 West Street Brattle Bookshop." They filled it up with books, and they drove it from where the store was at the end of Washington Street near City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common to where West Street is, and then back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic at the time was a friend of his, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He'd gotten his point across. And we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. On February 1st of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. The building was on fire, and it literally burned to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to keep going, to continue, to not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. We rented folding tables. People either sold, gave us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And like I say, even though it was a meager stock, within a month we reopened. Like I say, it was mainly just keep going, continue. Over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is, again, a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1.03 and $5, 2 floors of general used books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, first editions, leather bindings, and so on. And that type of business, the large, old, general, second-hand bookstore, especially in the inner cities, is a dying business. And it's not dying because people don't like books, buy books, read books, sell books, but property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores which I assure you are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world. One right after the other have gone out of business. In the last few years, the internet has speeded that process along. Now, like I say, we bought our building in the early 80s, so I hope to do this for years to come. I have daughters who are in their early 30s. I don't think they have any intention of coming into this the way I did. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I don't know. I'm sure they were talking about them all the time. And then I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year now has been a little over 40 years, and I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. Thank you. If you would ask me what's one item, and these items I'm not going to pass around. I know that some of them are small, but they'll be up here at the end if you want to see them. If you would ask me what's one item I wish I could find and get, is a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian, done in 1827. It doesn't look like very much, but the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's his first book. It's a classic rarity in American literature. And the first copy actually to really show up and be found was on a dealer's 10-cent table in the 1890s. Another dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out, and in 1890 sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were two postmen in the New Bedford, who on the side were book scouts, and being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were and book sales. Bought a trunk of books, bottom of the trunk was a Tamerlane. Families got involved, they got to negotiating, and after 6 months they sold it for $10,000. Now I don't know if it was worth it, because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again, but they got their $10,000. And then about 20 years ago in Newburyport, an antique dealer died. His whole estate was auctioned, painting, prints, furniture, antiques, books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each. Someone picked out a Tamerlane, and about 20 years ago sold it for $198,000. And one sold a couple of years ago for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I bring with me are originals, but I don't bring $1,000,000 pamphlets. But if any of you want to take a close look and then go home and check your attic, cellars, basements, whatever, if you find one, please give me a call. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying it, is appreciating it. It's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Someone might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say, that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really that knowledge and understanding that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Now, on the surface, I think this one's interesting, but the story behind it, maybe even a little bit more so. This is on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's a most important post, etc., etc., signed always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt, and it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, on the surface, this seems like a great honor. It's an ambassadorial appointment. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which of course he probably was. And Curley's response to Roosevelt was, remember, this was 1933. He said, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, as a matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's opinion of Washington didn't change over the years. We also have a about 10 letters that he wrote to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into prison, and he wrote to his wife, and he said, "Many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington." In any case, enough for Curly and so on. Not only do I get books and all sorts of material, but we get brochures, programs, letters, documents. Here's a program from the 1912 World Series. The Red Sox played the Giants. The Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, won a few more times in the teens, and then we had to wait an awfully long time. And not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are 2 for $1. Shirts are $1.50 and $2. I don't think you'll get them for that nowadays. And it's become very popular to go on cruises and cruise ships. And I have a brochure here for a ship, tells you how wonderfully built, where to book passage, and anyone who wants to go on the Titanic. There's a brochure, and almost anything you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. There's also a tendency when you're talking about collecting that all of a sudden everything seems to be worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And I always like to point out not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And the large majority of these sell for just a few dollars. There are a few exceptions, but the large majority are very cheap. And we used to, on a wall by a stairway at the store, we used to have 50 to 100 of these more famous Life covers hanging on the wall. And people would stop and stare at that wall, sometimes a half an hour at a time, just sort of lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the stories, the articles, the photographs, made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell on the right day. And one time a regular customer came in and bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II. And it's not what he normally bought. So I said to him, "Why are you buying these?" And he said, "Well, I want to teach my children about World War II." And he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the old Lifes, look at a few of the photos, read an article or two, and then discuss it with them. It sounded like a good idea to me, but I was skeptical. He came in a few weeks later and I said to him, "How's it going with the Lifes?" He said, "Fabulously," but not the way I thought. He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they had read everything anyways. I have a cookbook here from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. And then you have how to bake eels the common way. I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but that's beside the point. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island. Every day, never knowing who you're going to see, the people, the places, the books. And I'll relate a few of those stories to you and then maybe see about some questions. This was a while ago. I was out of the store. I got back. There was a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called and had some books. I called her up and she said, "Oh yes, my father died. He has 500 art reference books in Providence. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested?" Well, 500 art reference books sounds like quite a good library. It's only an hour drive from Boston. They lived on an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. I got to the house. It was a large old colonial house, got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought about 80% of the books I wanted. I was happy, she was happy. And she said, my mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university, some are being sold at auction, but would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there? Well, their house in Newport was one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those houses in mansions that was still being lived in by a family, and at one point wandering from the basement to the attic all on my own, without a tour guide going, stay here, go here, don't touch this, that, but literally just wandering through the whole house on my own. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to a mansion in Newport, not quite as big as the Browns. This was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry, and what they needed an appraisal. And when I come to groups like this, I give hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me in the Brattle Bookshop. I don't care if you think of 10 others. I have cards here, we have 800 numbers, websites, and so on. And one of the ways I feel I can get people to think of us is by giving out as much free information as reasonably possible. But there are times when people need very formal written appraisals for insurance, estate taxes, and so on. Then I discuss a fee. In any case, mansion, Newport, Perry family, and what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But it was the day-to-day accountings of the ships, and they were fascinating to read through. They would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg. And that was the last you heard of the captain, so that's a little different nowadays, too.
Basic work. Yeah.
When my father was still alive, and he died over 35 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but it sounded like there might be some interesting things. And she lived in Sharon, so it was pretty close. We decided to go to a house. We got to the house. It was a little ranch house. Paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say, oh, gee, what's going to be here? And she was elderly. She answered the door. We walk in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. And she got to talking. She was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution. And she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe and all the court intrigues and all the goings on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle, but there was a lot more to it. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy. The stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into the house, on one of the walls, she had 10 watercolors. They were probably this size, pastoral European scenes. And when I first saw them, I thought they were really nice. And the more she talked and the longer we were there and the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice. And she sort of said, oh yes, they're all Turners. So she had 10 original Turner watercolors, probably $1 million worth of painting. It was like, oh yes, they're all, so you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 20 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go? He said, well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who can tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. And he obviously was a young man at the time. He said he was really looking forward to this dinner, all the learning and insight he was going to get from these two men. He said he was excited. He got there a little bit early, sat down. 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was quite elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite them. And he said the first thing Ford did was turn to Edison and yell, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pill." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. Now I can go on and on and on with these stories. I'll tell one more and then see about some questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store, people wanting to know, do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or what's the value? How much does it worth? And what's so on? And most of those questions we can answer right off the top of our heads. The people I work with and myself. Some are a little more involved. Occasionally you really do some research, but that can be fun too. And then every once in a while you get a call that really stands out. And this was again a while ago. I answered the phone, "Hello, Brattle Bookshop, can I help you?" Lady, elderly, very thick Irish brogue, and the first thing she says is, "President Kennedy slept with me." Now, you have to admit that gets your attention. And she stopped and waited for it to sink in. And then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family. She had been his nursemaid. When he was 3 and 4 years old, he used to sleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Now, presidential letters of any type have value. Handwritten letters from a later 20th century president are very high-priced and valuable. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet. I went to her house. Great stories, fabulous recounting of things. The letters were tremendous. I gave her what I thought was a really great price on them, but much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. They were a part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong. Again, maybe someday. And one of the things I will say is, in talks like this, I like to tell stories, and people sometimes ask me if I collect anything, and I'll talk about one thing at the end, but I collect stories now. Literally, when things come up, I write down a line or two, and I have page after page, and I've just started doing a podcast. So if any of you either go to Apple, iTunes, or wherever you get, there's one called Brattlecast that I relate this type of story and listen to it and subscribe to it. The more people, the better. But it's called Brattlecast, and I think it's good, but in any case. Like I say, I can go on and on and on with these stories, but why don't I see if there are some questions? Because quite honestly, anything you ask me, I can go off on a tangent. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Well, why would there not be a copyright date on a book? I always thought all books had copyright dates.
Well, there are two things. There are two things about dates. I don't know if you're talking about a copyright date or a publishing date.
Publishing date, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah.
First of all, you don't have to copyright a book. What a copyright does is it gets put in the Library of Congress, but it also says that you're the author of this book, you own the literary content of that book. But if you don't care, you don't have to copyright it, which means there's no copyright date. But I knew when you asked that question, why is there no date on the title page? Again, that's up to the publisher. They can put it on, they cannot put it on. But the most common reason that you don't see a date on the title page, it's usually a book that's a sort of a fancier book, a nicer book, something that you might give as a gift. And think about this. Let's say a publisher publishes 1,000 books. And they're fancy, and they're expecting maybe it's a good Christmas present, people are going to buy it for Christmas. But let's say in 1900, they only sell 500 of those books. Well, if there's a date on it, in 1901, that's gonna look like last year's book. But if you don't put a date on it, you can sell it in 1901, 1902, and it's a perfectly good gift. So in most cases, when you see books like that, you can sort of almost see them being a gift at some point, and that way the publisher they don't go out of date. And that's the usual reason. I mean, there can be a million others, but that's the usual reason they don't have dates. And when you think of it, it makes
Yeah, it
perfect
does.
sense.
Good marketing.
Yes.
Yeah, if there's only one day, does that mean it's a first edition?
The question is, if there's only one date, does that mean it's a first edition? No, that does not mean it's a first edition. Each publisher, each publishing house usually has their way of distinguishing first editions, and many times over the years that even changed. Now, if you look at the copyright date, which is usually on the other side of the title page, and let's say it says, well, actually there's a book that just came in, let's say it says 1850. If the date on the front is 1850, chances are you've got to check to see if it's a first edition. If it says 1950, there's a very, very good chance that it's not the first edition. So by looking at the date, many times you can rule out a book not being a first edition, but you can't necessarily 100% rule in that it is a first edition. And then sometimes it can even get it gets more complicated. Just this week, I bought a book. The date on the book, on the copyright on the book was 1850. It was inscribed by the author, Christmas 1849. Now, you sort of say to yourself, well, gee, if the book was put out in 1850, how does it have a well, what happens, a lot of books, if the publisher could do it, and it was scheduled to be put out in 1850, if they could get it out for Christmas a little bit ahead of time, they do that. And in this case, the author, and if it was particularly if it was a popular author, they, again, and in this case it was Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he had signed it to one of his family at Christmas 1849. So, first of all, Emerson's a good person to have it signed by. Second of all, that it was inscribed to one of his family members is good, and he actually signed it Waldo, because that's what his family and friends called him. So all of that, I'll add it that it's a very nice book. But it's very, very complicated. And then there can be cases where there are some books, there was one book that wrote on the book 35th edition, and it was actually the first. But the publisher and the author thought, well, gee, if people think this book has gone through 35 editions and it's sold that well, it must be a really good book. So people will buy more of it if you put that on. In any case, there's another, I'll get one more story about first. There's also sometimes you don't want the first edition, that actually a later edition is more valuable. There was a traveling minister in the late 17, early 1800s. And he also wrote books and published books and distributed his own books. And he wrote a life of George Washington. And he sold 4 editions of it. It sold very well. But in the 4th editions, the sales started to drop off a little. In the 5th edition, he made up the story about the cherry tree. And so the 5th edition of Parson Weems' Life of Washington is the first edition that has the cherry tree story. That's the one the collectors want. Yes?
I was going to ask, in the period between 1875 and, say, 1900, in Boston, was there a #1 publishing company? Or
Well, the question is, between the 1870s and 1900, was there a #1 publishing company? No, not
in
really.
Boston?
In Boston, no, there really wasn't, because there were a lot of publishers in Boston. There was Little Brown, there was Houghton Mifflin, there was The Atlantic, and on and on and on. So there were a lot of the major publishing industry in the United States was in New York or Boston. But Boston, now a lot of those companies, Little Brown, Houghton Mifflin, and so on, in the last 20, 30 years have moved to New York or been absorbed, or the Atlantic. But It's not that there was one, there were lots of major publishers in Boston. So that's, yes.
How important is condition?
Well, condition is very, very important. Now, usually when collectors want a book, they want it as close to it the way it came out as it possibly can be. So let's say you have a book, it's very plain, very fragile, and you know, in the past, some people would say, well, you want to put a better binding, a stronger, no, you don't want to do that. But maybe you want to have a very fancy box made for it, or a very simple box. And that could be relatively cheap, or if you want to do jewel encrusted leather binding, it could be expensive, but then you put the original inside that. So the closer it is to the original in the best possible shape that it can possibly be, that's usually the way the collectors want it. But there are books that are so rare, so valuable, that, yeah, they can be valuable. Well, at the beginning of the talk, I said a page from the Gutenberg Bible is worth $50,000 to $100,000. I mean, that's a page out of a book. You know, I assure you, most books, if you rip a page out, not only is the book not going to be valuable, but the page isn't valuable either. Audubon, the prints. I mean, those prints all came out of books. If you go into print shops, maps, most of the old maps came out of atlases. So, yes, there are exceptions, and there are books that are literally so hard to get that a collector will accept it in almost any condition, and it will have value. Now, the better and the closer, the more it can go up. But condition, it's one of those things that is quirky and odd. And here's an example that's a huge extreme. I mentioned Great Gatsby before. Great Gatsby, if you have a very nice copy of the first edition without the dust jacket, it's worth anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000, depending exactly how nice, how perfect it is, and so on. The paper dust jacket, if you have a perfect paper dust jacket on Great Gatsby, it's worth $200,000 or $300,000, which means that dust jacket is worth $200,000 to $300,000. Now, one of the reasons for that is Great Gatsby's a classic. The dust jacket on that is a particularly flimsy made. The colors on it are particularly fade very easily. And there's all sorts of things wrong with that dust jacket. But if you have it perfect, so that's perfect condition. Not perfect condition can be a couple of $100,000 difference. And that can go, and like I say, it also depends on why the people want the book. I mean, if you just want the book to read, then the condition doesn't make as much difference. But to the collector, it does. I'll tell you, was that a question? Or?
Yeah.
I'll take one more question and go.
Yeah.
Very simple. I have some invitation to the dedication of the Brooklyn Bridge and the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. Do you appraise those sort of documents? It's not in a book or anything. It's just
Well, sometimes, yes, dedication, so on, they fall into ephemera. Some of that I can do very well, very easily. Some of it I can't do. And one of the things, actually, that's a good question. When you're doing this, you can never know everything. It's absolutely impossible. But you might know where to look to find everything, and more importantly, you know who to call to find everything. So there are a lot of times when something will come in, and I'll know a colleague of mine just had a collection just like that. And I'll call them up and say, well, gee, you know, how did that go? What is this? What should I look for? Well, why don't you come in on me with this, because you know this is your field. So it's almost as important to know who to call, who to check, where to do it as anything. So a lot of what you're mentioning you can do, but it's a general question, so I would say probably most of it, yes. All of it, who knows? And one of the things that's really important is knowing what you don't know. and being able to say and a lot of times when I do appraisals at the end here, what will happen is someone will bring in a book. Let's say Huckleberry Finn, it's a good example. In Huckleberry Finn, there's about 10 things that you have to check. On page so-and-so, there's a misspelling. On this other page, a piece of type fell out and it cracked. And in this page, there's an illustration that shouldn't be there. You don't remember every one of those. But at an appraisal event like this, what I can do is I can look at the book, and if it appears that it might be, I can say, if this is the first edition, it's worth this. If it's not the first edition, it's worth that. Call me up tomorrow, have the book in front of you, I'll pull out my reference book and say, okay, check page, check page, check page. And you do it that way. You can't remember everything. I'll tell you what, at this point, why don't I do 1 or 2 appraisals? Did anyone bring a Bible? If you want, I'll do that. And did anyone bring a Victorian cloth illustrated book that has a very decorative cloth illustrated cover? And one of the reasons that I asked for these has nothing to do with the value of the books. They just lead into good stories.
I have a good story.
Well, anyways, I'll do that one. I have to see the cover to see if I. Yeah, sure. That will. Let me first say something. And of course this one's going to be tricky because it's in. It looks like
Czech language.
Czech, whatever. But I can still tell the story. Let me first say something about appraising books. When I appraise at a group like this, I usually give a retail value. In other words, that value that you would pay if you came into my store or a store like mine. It is not what you would get if you're selling the book. If you're selling the book, you should expect to get about 1/3 to 2/3 of the retail. If you're dealing with the very low end, the markup might even be higher. You got to make some money. When you get to much higher priced items, the percentages can come down. A number of years ago, I had a copy of Audubon's quadrupeds, not the birds, but the animals, but the big, huge 155 hand-colored plates. At the time that I bought that copy, I paid $100,000 for it. I sold it in 2 weeks for $105,000. That's only a 5% markup, but it's $5,000, well worth the time and effort I spent. And I pretty much had it pre-sold before I even bought it. So when you get to the much, much higher values, the percentages can come down, especially on things that are going to turn over quickly, just because the amounts of money involved is so much more. Also, everything I say is subjective. In other words, the fact that I say something's worth $100 doesn't mean a colleague of mine won't say 125, and another colleague say 75. So if you know what you have, you go to somebody, you get a price, you're happy, great. If you're not sure, get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. It actually probably comes down more to the amount of time and effort you want to spend. Now, the first book we have here is something. Do you know what it is, by any chance? The title or the...
This golden Prague.
Okay.
This means Zlatá Praha.
And
It is the illustration there.
yeah, it's done in the 1890s. It has nice illustrations. It's some religious art and so on. You can sort of see it. The thing is, I don't know, I haven't had this book specifically, but I've had lots of books like this from the 1890s in English that have these black and white illustrations, large, sort of nice history, art, travel books, and they are not terribly popular right now. They just don't sell well. They don't fit on people's shelves well. People, if you want to see pictures, even of the past now, you can Google them all. If this was 100 years earlier, with original engravings and so on, people like those. This falls into the middle. In other words, it's not old enough that the collectors who really collect this type of thing like this style. Yet, on the other hand, so much more has been updated, and you can see what's in this and the knowledge in it. So this would probably sell in the $25, $35, maybe $50 range, and it wouldn't sell easily at that. But the reason that I asked for this, and if someone hadn't had one, I actually happen to have a book with an illustrated cover also. Before they had dust jackets on books, a lot of books had very nice illustrated covers. And dust jackets, as we know them, were around World War I. I mean, they go back a lot earlier, but sort of the really fancy decorative dust jackets. And that was more printing technology. But before they had that, a lot of people would have books like this, and I'm going to hand this back. So this is probably in the $25 to $50 range.
Okay, thank you.
If somebody, but it would be hard. But the reason they had, it's just easier for me to hold this one. If they would have these decorative covers, and one of the reasons they'd have them is if you walked into a bookstore and the cover caught your eye, there was probably a better chance you'd buy it. And there are people who collect books like this just for the decorative covers. You can go to library sales, yard sales, book sales, auctions, antique stores, and pick up a lot of these really, really cheaply. I mean, they're expensive ones, don't worry, you can spend a lot of money too. But you can pick them up, and individually they might not seem like much, but graphically, as a collection, they can be quite nice. As a matter of fact, I have a collection like that myself that started off as a bit of a joke. And one day I got a book, had a picture of a toilet on the cover, and the title was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper. Anyways, I brought it home, I showed it to my wife, she took one look at it and said, we have to put this in the bathroom. So we did. A couple of days later, I got another book, it had a big eye staring out of the cover. The title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, but with a big eye staring at you. I thought, put that in the bathroom too. Now, this is a little half bathroom, so there's no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, we built bookshelves, and now we have 300 or 400 of these Victorian-style illustrated books in our bathroom. People walk in, they're a little taken aback, but there's loads of reading material. And one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable, because every once in a while a book falls off the shelf, and you can imagine where it ends up. I like to end the talk talking about Bibles, and one of the reasons I like to do that is the Bible is the most commonly printed book of all time. It always has been, probably always will be, and we sometimes get 5-10 calls a week with people who have 100, 200-year-old family Bibles. And in most of those cases, we have to say to them, if this is your family Bible, it's been handed down through the generations, sentimentally, it's priceless. Monetarily, not worth that much, but in any case, is this one a family item?
It is, but what's interesting with that is right in the back
Yeah,
is a note from its origin.
Mesopotamia.
Right,
In 1918, so this would, World War I?
that's right.
And what was the relation?
It was an uncle that went back to that, and he sent it to his mother, I think.
Yeah, so, well, that's one thing I was gonna mention. So sentimentally, quite honestly, in the store, $5 or $10. Sentimentally, that's very important. And what happens is, a lot of times, people will have those large old family Bibles in the late 1800s with the gorgeously embossed with the covers and the clasp, and they make wonderful birthday or anniversary presents, or they make wonderful for graduation for divinity students, priests, ministers retiring, but if they're in perfect shape, they sell for $100, $300. Break one clasp, lose one hinge, they lose all that value. Now, these type of things, where these show up, not so much from World War I,
Yeah.
but the Civil War.
Yeah.
People have them, and of course, then you hear the stories about like when Teddy Roosevelt was giving a speech, and someone shot him, and it hit the Bible, and saved his life. But a lot of times in those big Bibles or these Bibles, there's also family histories, births, deaths, marriages, or there are things like this that make it for your family. You know, anyone else looks at it, you know, I picked up because of where it was and the date, there was probably World War I, and probably, but it means a lot to you. And a lot of times, these.
Thank you.
Sure, and that's great. I mean, it's great that the family still has it. But a lot of times, when you have those birth, death records, the local historical or genealogical society would love to have it, but they don't want the whole Bible. They just want to Xerox out that page, maybe the title page, but they don't want the whole Bible. But it's always worth checking, because there are Bibles that are quite bad. This is a Gutenberg Bible, there are others. So it's always worth checking. Most cases, maybe not. And I'm going to end the talk on one last story about Bibles. I got called into a large old church in Boston, well over 100-year-old church. And they had a huge library, and they wanted me in there just to see that if over the years they had accumulated any valuable books. And I spent a day there, and they actually had some really good books. It was a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? There are a few more books. I looked at the books there and so on. And then there was a closet. It was probably more like a small room. It would have covered this area. Priest opened the door, front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest and I said, what is this? He says, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? They come and they present it to the church. And he says, what do? We very graciously accept it. We don't want to offend anybody. Then we go downstairs, open the door, throw it in the rest of it. And he says, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That just wouldn't be right. So I use it as an example to say that if you want to give something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, that's great. But if not, you're really not doing anyone a favor. I'm going to end the talk in just a minute. I have cards here. We have 800 numbers. There are some over there. We have websites. Don't ever feel that you're bothering myself, the people I work with. We'd rather have 100 people call with nothing special than to have the 101st person say, I just threw away a Tamerlane. Now, the way I do the appraisals is I just do them in a crowd scene. Quite honestly, the less order there is, the faster it goes. If anybody wants to stand over my shoulder and sort of overhear what I'm saying, that's fine. And I don't have any problem. If anyone has actually a whole stack of books, I'll do them all, but if there's a line, I'll do one or two and then tell you to go to the end of the line. It's not fair to everybody. And basically I'll just say thank you very much and then literally just bring things up and I'll start doing it. So thank you.